Hey folks, this is Kelani. With the beta chugging along quite nicely and a new build coming out every week, there's always something new to talk about. Either Blizzard is changing a class, breaking the quest log, or undoing changes from previous builds. But a few things really stuck out from the previous week, so I wanted to have a little chat about the changes to tank threat, the Azerite armor UI changes, and touch on a few abilities which were taken off the GCD. Threat has been an up and down rollercoaster for pretty much the entire game's life cycle. The little joke of waiting for 3 sunders before starting to deal damage was an actual thing back in vanilla. You had to actively track your threat so you didn't pull aggro accidentally. You also usually had to give your tank a bit of time to get a head start on threat so the DPS wouldn't have to stop partway through the fight. If you got too close to the tank on the threat meter, you best just auto-attack for a little bit. Maybe pull out your wand or just stop what you're doing altogether if you're really that close. That's one extreme of threat where everyone has to keep an eye on it, but Legion went to the complete other side of extremes where a tank can throw an ability or two into a whole pack of monsters and just not have to worry about losing aggro on them. Tanks generate so much threat these days that threat almost isn't a thing anymore. No one really has to worry about it. You don't have to track it, and if someone pulls aggro it's because they got to a mob before the tank even hit it. Or the gear difference between the DPS and the tanks is massive. So what's the better scenario? What's the best middle ground here? Let's start by talking about what's changing going into battle for Azeroth. In Legion, a tank generates 10 times more threat than a DPS right now. With their artifacts and some special abilities which generate more threat, tanks can kick out 14 to 20 times the threat of a DPS. This made threat more or less a non-issue. A DPS just couldn't pull off you, providing you weren't AFK. Things have been toned down quite significantly in Battle for Azeroth. Now tanks will only generate 4 times the threat of a DPS. So if a DPS is doing more than 4 times your DPS as a tank, you're probably going to lose aggro to that guy. There are a few other changes to help you keep an enemy focused on your shield instead of running off for your cloth DPS. The first is high threat abilities. These aren't really anything new, but the way in which they generate extra threat has been changed slightly. An ability which generates extra threat will multiply the threat generated by an additional 4 times. So be sure to make good use of your heroic throws and throw glaives, either on pull or to help you pull mobs off your party members. The other change is to taunt, which provides an additional 5 times threat on your target for the duration of the taunt. So you can use taunt to both pull a mob straight to you or build up a good chunk of threat on a target you don't want running anywhere. This should also help with tank swaps to make sure you stay ahead of your co-tank without having to ask them to stop smashing their skulls into the boss or mob. So threat is being reduced across the board for tanks and we have a few tools to help mitigate the loss, but is this really going to be an issue, and if so, how bad is this going to get? If the overall threat reduction is going to sit around the 80% mark, it might feel a lot like Skittish weeks. Skittish provides a 75% threat reduction, which is more or less what we're getting going into Battle for Azeroth. That's got to make you question whether the Skittish affix was just a test so they could reduce tank threat by a significant portion and see what happens. If tanks can still hold threat during Skittish weeks and it's not really a problem, then surely we can just reduce the threat across the board, right? Maybe that's what they plan to do all along. Well, depending on the class and your tank, Skittish weeks could have either been a breeze or a living nightmare. Some tanks held threat much better than others, either due to their spammable ability like Thrash or their superior damage overall. But if you learned anything from Skittish weeks, it's probably that nuking the tits off a mob before the tank gets to hit it is a really bad idea, and you should probably hit your tank's target instead of picking a random mob you fancy the look of. It's doable and manageable as long as you keep it in mind. With that being said, this all depends on how much damage our DPS are kicking out. AoE damage has been reined in across the board. Most classes won't be dealing massive AoE damage across multiple mobs. The 2 exceptions I can think of, off the top of my head at least, are Elemental Shamans and Boomkins. They're still rocking some strong AoE. Half the classes have some decent AoE and then a handful have barely any. But overall I think a tank should have no problem keeping aggro on multiple mobs at the same time, unless you have some really strong bursty single target damage dealers that are all hitting different targets. That could get messy, but a death or 2 should teach them to hit the tank's primary target. That skull marker is going to see a lot of use in dungeons for sure. As long as DPS don't get too crazy and tanks can still keep up, I wouldn't foresee too many threat issues in the majority of cases. There are examples where this threat reduction might be a problem though. The first is fairly obvious. undergeared tanks. If you can't keep up with threat because you don't deal enough damage as a tank, you're probably going to get trampled on the threat meter and your DPS will end up taking aggro from you. Even though this might sound like a problem, it might end up being totally fine. If you're an undergeared tank compared to the DPS, chances are your DPS can take a hit or three without many problems. Either they're way overgeared for what you're doing, like a few jacked DPS queuing into a random normal dungeon, or you're undergeared for what you're trying to do, like hopping into a raid 30 item levels below what it drops. Either way, your DPS should be fine taking a few hits, or you're actually somewhere you shouldn't necessarily be. If everyone is suitably geared for the content you're doing, threat shouldn't be too much of a problem. The other major example where threat might become a bit of a problem is when tanks try to pull kite. This is very popular in Legion, especially in Mythic Plus. A tank will throw a few AoEs into a pack of mobs and kite them to the next pack, rinse and repeat while your DPS happily goes to town on the mobs blindly following your tank. The tank doesn't take much damage because they're kiting constantly, the DPS don't get aggro because the tank can hold threat with a handful of abilities and AoEs, and everything dies fairly quickly because AoE damage in Legion is kind of scary. Even with the AoE damage reduction to most classes, a tank won't be able to get and maintain threat for long periods of time while kiting. You have to be actively hitting the mobs, otherwise your DPS will out-threat you in no time, then all of the mobs you are kiting will turn right around and wail on your group. This might end up changing a lot about how people approach high-level Mythic Plus keys. The typical strategy right now is to group up as much as you can, kite it for as long as you can, and if you can't kite, chain AoE stun the mobs until they die. The threat reduction is going to play a huge part in changing that strategy, but AoE stuns were also reined in significantly. Only shamans, warlocks and monks have an AoE stun and the durations were reduced from 5 seconds to 3, so you won't be able to kite and you won't be able to chain AoE stun them until they die. We might actually have to tank the mobs this time around. This might be the main reason we're seeing these threat reductions too, which is pretty interesting. I'm really excited to see how high level Mythic Plus keys will turn out with all of these changes in the mix. I do wonder if classes with threat redirection will become even more valuable with the threat reduction. Things like misdirection could be the difference between being able to chain pull and kite and having to tank one group at a time. That's definitely something to be excited about if you're a hunter or a rogue. Overall, I don't think threat will become too much of an issue. A few people might have to pay a little more attention to what they're hitting, some tanks might have to up their game to hold aggro as well as they did in Legion, but I would expect everyone to adapt and overcome these changes. I don't think we'll be back to vanilla level of threat where you have to stand around with your thumb up your butt while your tank gets a good head start on threat. Hopefully people won't be scared away from tanking because of these changes. We don't need any longer queue times for dungeons, but honestly at the end of the day if we do see some huge problems with tanks holding aggro across all types of content, I doubt Blizzard would just keep things the way they are. If this threat change isn't working or doesn't work, they'll likely make a few adjustments. They're not going to shoot themselves in the foot that badly. So that's the tank threat stuff and how I feel about it, but I also wanted to touch on the new Azerite armor user interface. This is pretty cool. If you remember back to our previews of the Azerite armor system, how it works and what abilities we'll have to play with, you might recall the user interface looked pretty lame. That's because it was a work in progress. Here we have the updated version. We're still in beta, so this might not be finished yet, but it's looking much better. It looks very similar to what was on show at BlizzCon, and it's actually sort of similar to the Path of Titan system that was scrapped many expansions ago, so maybe that system stuck around in essence and that's what we have today. So the way this works is we have 3 rings, or 4 rings for gear later on, and each ring has several abilities for us to choose. When you select an ability and lock it in, the circle will rotate and slot that ability in the top. When you get enough Azerite for your next ability, you can unlock that as well, and when you reach the center you can unlock the +5 item level boost to your item. There's also a pretty satisfying grinding and lock-in sound when you choose your traits. Now, I've said it many times before, but I still think that last slot is fairly boring for it to just be a +5 item level, but I've had a little bit of a change of heart. After reading a few other posts about people talking about the last ability being fairly lame, someone pointed out that having the exciting stuff on the last trait means you would always be grinding towards the good stuff, but if you have the good stuff at the start and something more passive and tame at the end, you're rewarded right from the get-go. You can get a new piece of Azerite gear, unlock some cool traits, and when you eventually unlock the last one, it's not actually that big of a deal, so there's no real need to rush towards it. If you compare this to the artifact power system, where our artifacts had kind of boring and bland passives for the majority of our progress, with the really good stuff being at the end, everyone felt like they absolutely had to rush towards the next artifact power unlock. Artifact power became a huge grind just to get to the end, so maybe it's a good thing that Azerite armor is trying to stay clear of that end result. Either way, the new user interface looks really cool, and I'm glad we don't have to look at the placeholder UI anymore. Now, if there was only a way to change your locked-in traits, I know there's going to be some way to change them later on down the line, but I think they're still deciding on how to implement the Azerite armor reset and how accessible it should be. Should it be a daily cooldown, a weekly cooldown, should it require a new reagent, etc, etc. We should be able to change our minds somehow, some way, we just don't have any details yet. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is the global cooldown changes. Lots of abilities were put on a global cooldown in Battle for Azeroth, and lots of abilities have been taken back off because they felt absolutely horrid tied to the GCD. Well, Bloodlust, Heroism and Time Warp are no exceptions. Can you imagine the arguments from mages and shamans at the start of every raid? It's your turn to lust. No, it's your turn to lust. I don't want to lust, I don't want to lose a GCD. Well, Bloodlust and Heroism are once again off the global cooldown, so we can all rejoice that we won't have to listen to the mages and shamans bickering over their opening GCD. Now, if only I could get my Hand of the Protector off the GCD again, I would be a happy prop paladin. At this point, it wouldn't surprise me if the whole idea was to just throw everything they could think of onto the GCD, so that when they went through it with a fine comb and started removing abilities, we ended up thinking, oh, this isn't too bad, at least XYZ isn't on the GCD as well. Those sneaky devs. But that's all for this video. What do you think about the tank threat changes? Do you think we'll see a lot of problems with tanks holding threat, or will it still be a non-issue? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. If you want to hop on that train, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.